Welcome to my Photography Masterclass. It's Friday. That means it's Masterclass Friday here at Adobe, and because you're watching on my own channel, you get the pre-stream couple minutes with a quick tip. So let's get to it. Since I literally only have like 3 minutes before we start the main show, I'm going to switch over to my desktop. Welcome everybody. And one of the things you'll notice on my desktop is I'm in Lightroom Classic. And one of the tips that I give people is that when you're, especially photographers, when you're culling down your shots, in other words, you got the ones that you like, or you got the ones the model like, or you got the one the client picked, whatever it is, whatever method you're using, pick flags, stars, or color labels, you can go to your attributes and you can say, just, give me all the greens. Those are the ones that I picked. So once I get those, I can select all, Command A or Control A. And then what I tend to want to do is I want to put them in their own collection, their own, I got a lot of collections here. Put them in their own collection, create a collection, and I'm just going to call that one Krista, because that's who she is, 2, Gallery 2, Edits, TW, because the green means those are the ones that I like. So, and I can sync those with Lightroom in the cloud as well, and I'm going to go ahead and do that. And that will just go ahead and create that brand new collection so that when I'm ready to edit, I don't have to worry about sifting through all the ones that didn't get picked or the ones that I don't want to edit. These are the ones I need to edit, and they're all nicely in a collection, so I can just keep working and not have to worry about running into the ones I don't want. Then I can turn off the attributes because I don't need the attributes anymore. They're all in a collection, and I can just go through them and edit them one by one. And if I do head over to Photoshop and I come back with the, retouched photo, then I can remove the original one from this collection, because what I'll end up with is a collection of all the final edits. I won't have any of the original raw files. I won't have any of the original untouched ones. And then I can deliver from this album. I can share the album online. I can make it public up here in the right-hand corner. I can just share the edits any way that I want. All right, so I'll put you back in the lobby, because in less than a minute, we're gonna go ahead and start the main show. Thanks for watching the pre-stream. We'll see you in a minute. Happy Friday, everyone. Welcome to my Photography Masterclass. My name is Terry White, Worldwide Design and Photography Evangelist here at Adobe. It's my pleasure to be streaming to you live once again on a Friday morning, my time, Friday afternoon, your time, Friday night, your time, depending on where you are in the world. But it's great to have you all here. Today we're going to be doing one of my favorite topics, and that's portrait retouching for photographers. So it's great to have so many of you here, and great to see so many of you watching on all the various platforms. I see you over on YouTube. I see you on Twitter. I see you on Facebook. Great to have you all here, and great to have you watching. Hey, Rafus, what's going on? So I see a bunch of people in the chat already over at Adobe Live or b.net/Adobe Live. And by the way, if you're saying, how come he's not paying attention to me, or how come he's not answering my question? Because unfortunately, I only can pay attention to the one chat during my masterclass. And if you want to be in that chat, then head over to this right here. So b.net/Adobe Live. And that's the chat I'll be paying attention to. So like, I see people like Rob Zilla in the house. Lots of people here today. So Sam, Perry, Arafus, Emma, Victoria, Mike, Michelle, Edwin, Christine, Mike, Estelle. So lots of people here today watching. So great to have you all here. All right, so without further ado, since I only have 53 minutes left of my hour, let's talk about today's topic and let's talk about what we're going to be doing today. So we're going to be working with portraits. And Jason Levine's in the house as well. So by the way, when I say it's Masterclass Friday, that means that all the evangelists do master classes every Friday. And just Jason Levine just reminded me that not only will you see my master class, and if you were here earlier, Paul started a master class before mine. We do a Photoshop Daily Creative Challenge right after mine, but then it just continues on with master classes from people like Jason Levine, doing audio and video, Kyle Webster doing drawing, Howard Pinsky doing UI, UX design in Adobe XD, and of course, Paul doing Photoshop and graphic design. So just a full packed day of good learning with an hour-long masterclass from each of us, and you get to just learn all day. So tune in, stay tuned, and you'll just keep learning and keep watching stuff back to back. All right, so like I said, today we're going to be doing portrait retouching. And when I wanted to make sure I specifically said for photographers, because there's different levels of portrait retouching, just like there's different levels of photography. You have amateur photographers, you have people that just shoot with their smartphones, you have people that shoot with professional gear, and you have people that make a living doing it versus people that are doing a hobby. So there are different levels to retouching as well. Like for example, the retouching we're going to learn to do is for the average photographer, but that doesn't mean that this is the kind of retouching you would see probably done on a magazine cover, because that's a whole different level of retouching where they're literally going in pixel by pixel and making sure every pixel is perfect. We're not going to spend that kind of time today. I've seen retouchers spend 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 hours on one portrait. That's not what this is. If that's the level of retouching you're looking for, then you should probably go to a professional retoucher that's all they do day in and day out. And we've had those on Adobe Live. I've hosted a couple of professional retouchers where like literally they spent hours retouching like an inch of skin just to make sure that inch of skin looked perfect. So that's not what we're doing today. We're doing just kind of general tips to make your portraits look better from what you got out of the camera. So that doesn't mean that these are going to be on magazine covers. That doesn't mean any of that. It just means we're going to just make people look better. So that's what we're going to do. Make them look like they look in person. And I'll explain what that means. So that also means not to overdo it on your portrait retouching, because and I'm guilty of it too. Back when I first started, like, oh my God, trying to make the person look perfect when that was just overdone. Skin smoothing, making it look like a porcelain doll or a Barbie doll or plastic. We don't want to do any of that. So I pull way back on portrait retouching. And again, just trying to make things look better. All right, or make people look better. All right, so with that said, or make them look natural, make them look the way they look. Okay, so I'm gonna pop over to my computer in just a second here. Let's go ahead and do that. And I'm gonna love overdoing it. Yeah, I try not to overdo it anymore. Even though I may still be guilty, but I definitely try not to overdo it anymore. All right, so let's pop over to my computer. And I'm gonna, first of all, this is gonna be all mostly Photoshop. So but I'm gonna start where, since this is for photographers, where a lot of photographers would start, and that is with their collection of photos from a particular shoot. So here's a particular shoot I did with one of my models here in Atlanta, back when, you could have face-to-face contact with people. So this was Krista, my second shoot with Krista. That's why it's called Krista 2. And I'm not sure where Krista and Krista 3 are, but I have Krista 2 right here. And the Krista 2 shoot ended up with, we took 557 frames. And out of those 557 frames, I liked some, she picked some, the makeup artist might have picked some, so forth and so on. But this is typically where you end up. You end up with, you've eliminated all your just horrible shots, your eyes closed, the flash didn't fire, whatever went wrong. You probably got rid of those and you ended up with these as your potentials. You shared a gallery with your client. Your client came back and said, yes, these are the 5, 10, 15, whatever you let your client pick. These are the ones I want. And then you now go in and start editing. So, for example, let's say I pick one of these. I'm going to pick one of these as my favorite. So, by the way, and notice these are color labeled. Green is usually my color, even though I'm not a fan of green, but green is a color I just designated as my color years ago, and I never switched. There's no rhyme or reason for a particular color. But in Lightroom Classic, you can apply a star rating. So I can make it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stars or 0 stars if you hit the number 0 on your keyboard. You can give it a color label from color label from red to yellow to green to blue to purple, and I again pick green as my color. And what that freed up was, if I pick green as my color, then I would let the subject pick blue as their color. So if they're standing there next to me and they really like the shot, I would just tell them to hit the number, whatever the number that corresponds with blue is. I think it's 8 or 9. And they would just hit 8 or 9, and that would become their color. So here, let me test it. If I go and hit, it's 9. So if they hit 9 on the keyboard, then I knew that was one that they really liked. Now again, this was just standing there. I would always give them the ability to go and pick their, take time and pick the ones they really wanted. And then when they came back with the ones they really wanted, I would mark the ones they really wanted with a pick flag, with the letter P for pick. And then I would know, okay, all the ones with the pick flag are the ones the client chose to be edited. So that's my method for picking or designating which photos need to be retouched. So let's just leave it there. All right, but this is the one that I want to take a look at. So I'm going to hit full screen. And now that I'm in full screen, I can certainly see some areas that need to be retouched. But since I'm in Lightroom already, before I head over to Photoshop, there are some things I can do to kind of get the ball rolling right here in Lightroom. So for example, I'm going to pop out of the full screen. I'm going to pop over to the Develop module. And in the Develop module with this particular photo, I can see a few things that need to be done. So first of all, nothing's been done to this photo. It has no adjustments from Lightroom. It has nothing done to it. And like I always tell, I always walk through these same things over and over again. So lens correction, I would go ahead and enable the profile correction. And it does a minor tweak of the photo. You can see it kind of move in a little bit. And that's just correcting for any lens distortion. Now, if I had taken this in challenging light or outside or a sunset behind her or anything like that, I might go ahead and try and remove chromatic aberration. And that typically would, I don't need to do it here, but that would typically be in a case where you start to see like a green halo around your subject. That's usually from chromatic aberration. And that's what this checkbox does. It just removes it. But just simply enabling the lens profile correction says, okay, I know you shot that with this particular camera, this particular lens, this particular body. I'm going to switch to this profile to correct the lens. Okay, great. So now I head back to the basic profile or basic panel. And the next thing I'm going to do is choose a profile. So because I'm working with a portrait, I might start with portrait. Now, these are camera raw profiles. So if you shot in JPEG, you won't have access to these because they're camera raw profiles. They're not JPEG profiles. So it lets me get a starting point for like portrait. And again, it's very subtle. Like I can't even tell any difference between color. Oh, I see a bare minimum difference. And that's just giving me a starting point of where to go. Now, at this point, the next thing I typically do is I let Adobe Sensei, I let the machine learning in Lightroom kind of get me started with all these sliders. I can go in and start adjusting them manually. So if I thought it needed to be, higher exposure, I could do that. If I thought it needed to be more contrast, I could do that. But rather than me going in and picking these things manually, I always like to do an auto tone. And one more thing before I do the auto tone, the other thing I would always do is, and I would do this on all the shots, so I would just correct the white balance first before I do anything else. And I think the white balance is okay on this shot, but I would click the white balance eyedropper, I would be looking for something around 18% gray, but there's no gray in this photo. She's wearing a black dress. There's a black background. There's no gray here to click on. So when you have absence of gray, then what you should be looking for is something that should be black or should be white. So in this case, there's no white in this photo to click on, but there's a background that should be black. If I click on that background, again, it made a very minor adjustment to the temperature because it was already pretty much white balanced. But you would see a shift if your white balance was off to become more neutral. And at that point, you could go in and still tweak the temperature because when you're working with people, neutral isn't always the most attractive. So you might go in and you might adjust the temperature to be a little warmer. So for example, if I thought that that was still, I think it looks good, but if I thought it was too cool or too warm, I would adjust the temperature and I could warm her up, warm her skin tone. That's too much. That's too much, but I could warm the skin tone up a little bit more if I thought it needed it. But again, I kind of like the neutral white balance on this shot, so I don't really need to do anything else. What is the key of aesthetic portrait? I'm not sure I understand the question, Ferry, so keep asking me. You're impressed to see that I shot this portrait with a 70 to 200 millimeter lens. I always use a 70 to 200 millimeter lens. Why does that impress you? But yeah, that's my favorite portrait, one of my favorite portrait lenses. So that's the one I probably shoot the most with for portraits. Yeah, I love the compression, especially that you get at 200 millimeter. And also shooting with a 70 to 200 millimeter lets you get further back from the portrait, so you're not up on the person's face with all your camera gear. You can be further back and get some good shots. So not sure why that impresses you. A lot of people shoot portraits with 70 to 200 millimeter. All right, let's go ahead and move on. And so what I said I would do next after I fix the white balance is just go ahead and hit that auto tone button and let Lightroom do what it thinks it needs to do. Now, as I have always said, auto doesn't mean I'm going to agree with it for 100% of what it is. So that doesn't mean that I'm like, oh, this is perfect, and I can move on. Nope, it made it darker. I don't like that, so I'm just going to go ahead and bump the exposure back up again. Now, I do like some of the other things it has done. For example, it increased the vibrance, but it also increased the saturation. I usually almost never increase the saturation. I almost never increase the saturation when I'm working with people. So I would double click that one, put that one back to 0. Even though it only made a minor adjustment, I typically would not do anything with saturation with skin because vibrance will be more non-destructive to skin as opposed to saturation. All right, I see a couple more questions here. So wouldn't you shoot a gray card prior for the lighting setup? Sure. If you shot a gray card, then you've got gray to click on for your white balance. If you didn't shoot a gray card, then you don't have white. You don't have it to click on. And I usually use one. So that's why, again, I probably did use one in this. That's why they're all white balanced okay. I don't have to do anything to them. But yeah, that's what you would do to make sure that your white balance is going to be at least on target, but not necessarily the best for skin. Tim's asking, is there an ideal color temperature for skin tones? Tim, it's all subject to your individual tastes. So for example, there's no ideal number because it depends on the person. So it depends on the situation. So I can't, like, what did I end up on? 4,500, 4,600, no, 4,800 for this one. Next one might need to be a little warmer. Next one might need to be a little cooler. There is no necessarily perfect number. It just, to your eye, what looks better. So neutral is what I would look at that as, like with a gray card or clicking in gray in the photo or clicking in black in this case in the photo, gets me to 0. In other words, that's where I start. Now, 0 could look okay with skin, but it may not. So in that case, then you might want to make it look a little warmer. There is no perfect number. I've never seen a number that, oh, just always use this number and it's going to be great. Or does it make no difference as long as the camera and lights are white balance? It can always make a difference because neutral may not look human enough. So just because everything's perfectly white balanced, that doesn't mean it still makes skin look good. So that's what I mean. It's going to be totally up to your taste of what you think should be warm enough for people. How long from the model should be from, or how long from model should be from model with 7200 lens? I'm typically about 8 feet back. So again, it depends on now if you want it full body, like full body from head to toe, then you might need to go back a little further. So basically, you're going to go back as far as you need to frame the subject. If you're doing a close-up headshot, you might be 4 or 5 feet away. If you're doing full body, you might be 8 to 10 or 15 feet away. It just depends on what you're trying to frame. But basically, you're 70 to 200, and if you cranked out at 200, then you're going to need to be even further back because you're saying zoom out to 200 to get the best compression on that lens, but then I need to be further back to be able to see all of the subject. Do you use automatic white balance in your camera? Usually, unless I'm in a particular lighting situation where like for example, if I look up and I see clouds, and I'm going to use cloudy. If I look up and I see fluorescent lights, I'm going to use fluorescent. It just depends. But typically in studio, I'm on auto. All right, and Sean's telling Ralph about the histogram. Okay, moving on. So now, the other thing I noticed in this shot is when I go up here, you see that little triangle in the upper left-hand corner of the histogram? That's letting me know that my shadows or blacks are filling in. And this one over here on the right-hand side is for your highlights. So when I hover over it, it's showing me the areas that are filling in. Now, typically, I wouldn't care if those areas were in areas of the photo I didn't care about. But this is in her hair. I should care about that. So what I would also do in this particular case on this photo while I'm here in Lightroom is once I hover over that and I can see, oh, there's blue in her hair, that means that area of the photo, those little blue dots, those little blue sections, are completely filled in. There's no detail. So what I'm going to do is just come down below this slider, below this triangle, I should say, and that's going to give me the black slider, and I can just move it over to the right until that triangle turns dark. So that means now when I hover over it, I don't see that blue anymore. That means there's no detail being lost in her hair. And that's why these warnings light up to let you know that, hey, you're losing detail in your shadows or you're losing detail in your highlights. Or your highlights are completely blown out or your shadows are completely filled in. So now that I've got that done, I did my lens correction, I did my auto, I did my profile. You could go into your effects and you could go into your presence down here and you could do texture, clarity, and dehaze, but for people, I probably don't need to do a ton of that while I'm here. So I'm just gonna go ahead and move on now to Photoshop. So a couple questions. Devin's asking, do you prefer using studio or nature for your shoots? I'm a studio guy because I can control everything as opposed to being outside and having to wait for the proper conditions and light and all that. So yeah. Outdoor shoots are amazing as long as everything's great, as long as the outside conditions are great. But with the studio, I can control the conditions, so that's where I usually spend most of my time. All right, hang on. Did I miss one? I thought I saw one, but then it disappeared. Oh, there we go. Same 7200 lens, my favorite lens, but now I use it for a new way. Okay, you're welcome, Emma. All right, so let's go ahead and move on. So now that I got this kind of pre-adjusted for my retouching, there are some retouching things I would probably want to do that I could probably start to try and do some of that stuff here in Lightroom, but it just would be so much faster to do it in Photoshop. So if it were a landscape photo, a travel photo, a street photography photo, or basically anything other than a person, I could probably finish it all in Lightroom. I could probably get 99, if not 100% of everything I wanted done in Lightroom. But because it's a person, I need to think, okay, can I do like skin retouching or removing blemishes or whatever with the spot removal or healing brush in Lightroom? Yeah. And here, let me give you an example. So let's go in, let's zoom in. So let's say that I wanted to remove this laugh line. Well, if I go to my spot removal tool here in Lightroom and I make my brush smaller with the bracket key, because we don't need a brush that big, and I go in and remove this, the minute I let go, it's going to guess a spot to pick from. And this time it guessed okay. And you could pick up that spot and move it around. You could say, no, 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 guess closer to the original and remove it. That's what I don't want to spend a lot of time doing. I don't want to have to keep correcting what it did because it didn't necessarily pick the spot that I wanted. So that's what I mean by, yeah, I can get it done here and this is all non-destructive and beautiful, but it's just going to take me more time to do it here than it would in Photoshop. I can do it so much faster in Photoshop. So you make your decision for what's easier for you, but I'm going to recommend most of you do most of this work in Photoshop. All right, for the sake of time, let's go ahead and move on. I'm gonna, now, I got the photo primed, ready to go. How do I get it over to Photoshop? Well, when I go Edit In, right-click, Edit in Photoshop, or just simply hit Mac, Command-E, PC, Control-E, that will take a copy of it over to Photoshop. Now, when I say a copy, because that was a raw file, a DNG, or in my case, it would have been an NEF file if it had been the original. Because that's a raw file, it has no choice but to make a copy because you don't edit the actual raw files in Photoshop. You edit a copy of the raw file. So a lot of people will come over to Photoshop and then instantly make a duplicate of the layer. And I'm not going to tell you not to do it if that's what you like doing. I'm going to tell you that you've already got a copy. That's the one that's back in Lightroom. This one's going to be untouched from anything I do in Photoshop. So if I ever completely mess up and need to get back to the original, I've already got the original back in Lightroom. But moving on, let's go in now that I've made my duplicate layer copy, and let's go ahead and zoom in and let's go ahead and talk about some of the things we want to do. So now that I'm in this duplicate layer, and I zoomed in on my subject, I can start to see some just minor things like, for example, this looks like a piece of makeup right here, just this little white spot. Like she's got earrings on, but she's got a third hole here with no earring in it. So I don't like to draw attention to things that are missing. So in this case, she's missing an earring because she just chose not to wear one that day. But then we should probably not have the hole there either. When we zoom in, everything looks good. But let's, like for example, this little white area here above her eyelash, I don't know what that is, but we should probably get rid of that. Everything else from I'm just calling out some things that I would start to pay attention to. Now, this little black mark here is probably a mole. And with moles, you have to be very careful because if the person identifies themselves by that mole, then you probably don't want to remove it. But if it's a mole like this one on her neck, that's probably not part of our identity, then I'd probably say it's fair game to let that one go. Same thing over here. Just things that aren't part of her makeup, you could probably let go. These little spots here, these are all little things that once gone will make your portrait look better. Now you also have some lines under the eyes. We all have them. But then you have some shadows too that are just caused by the different lighting that was used to take the portrait. So once you start to ask yourself, what are the kinds of things that need to go from a photo? I would say it's easier. So Natasha's asking, did the saturation change? It looks a little bit more saturated in this photo, or we'll go back to Lightroom and see. Did it change when it came over to Photoshop? And it looks like it did in this case. I'm not sure why, but it could be just a difference in color profiles as well. Anyway, so asking yourself what to remove, things that are temporary, acne, things that will be gone in a couple of weeks, things that aren't part of their makeup, meaning their identity, things that aren't part of who they are, that don't define them. Those are the kinds of things you're probably going to ask yourself. Those are probably fair game to let go. All right, so let's go ahead and retouching can often reduce. Yes, exactly. And Tim's saying, don't forget that reducing can often be better than removing. So just making it less visible doesn't mean that it's gone. It just means it doesn't stand out as much. Okay, so let's go into my favorite tools for this. So one of my tools of choice is, in this case, the spot healing brush, because the reason I like the spot healing brush is because it's just fast and automatically uses the pixels around your subject. So I'm going to use, for people that are just wondering what I'm using here, so I've got a Wacom Cintiq that I'm looking at in front of me, and that Cintiq is got a stylus that I'm actually going to do my retouching right on the screen. So when you see me use the stylus, that's what I'm doing right on screen to remove those things that, again, are temporary, that we don't see in person, that make our subject look better. All right, so I'm going to go back to removing that out of my way, out of your way. And again, that little thing up there, don't know what that is, but we should probably get rid of it. All right. Now, there's a hot spot from the light on her nose. So that's just, again, a hot spot from the flash that I used right on her nose. So I might go into the patch tool, make a selection around that whole spot, and I just want to reduce it by just moving it up to where now it's not as hot. It doesn't stand out as much, but the nose is still illuminated. So the patch tool and my healing brush are my quick ways for removing things like that. Another laugh line. That again, I don't think anyone would miss. And how much time you spend on this, of course, is going to be up to you and your client. Like, you know, are you going to remove every little thing or no? That's, again, removing every little thing can probably be a little unnatural. So in this case, I might remove part of a laugh line, but not all of it. It just depends. So right now I'm just doing a quick pass, removing some of the obvious things that jump out at me. Oh, I didn't mean to do that. There we go. And I'm holding down my space bar to kind of pan around and get to get around the image quicker. All right, did I mention how to airbrush the face? What do you mean by airbrush? That's an old technique. What do you mean by that in today's digital world? All right, there we go. Just removing all the little blemishes quickly. Okay. All right, let's zoom back out. There we go. And now the next thing I might do is I'd probably go in and start looking at the eyes. Eyes really help define people in the portrait. So you want to make the eyes look as crisp and as sharp as possible. So one of the things that, you know, I remember techniques I used to use back in the day for brightening the eyes or whitening the eyes. And I don't do that stuff as much as I used to, but I definitely will go in. Like, for example, she's got a little redness over here on the right-hand side. So just using that same healing brush to kind of reduce it, not remove it completely, because again, that would be unnatural, but just reduce it a little bit. And if healing is not working because there's so much redness around it or so much shadow around it, then you could maybe just use another part of the eye to kind of patch it out. There we go. There's some yellow right there on the edge. Now another technique is to use that color. So use that color of the eye. So let's grab my eyedropper and let's sample that color of the eye, the white part of it. And let's use, or it's actually kind of grayish, but let's sample it. Let's see if we get a brighter color. There we go. And then we'll use a brush like on 20% opacity. (20% opacity), a much smaller brush, of course. And we kind of just paint it out. And each time you release the mouse and press down again, you're getting another 20%. So that's why you start on something like 20% so you don't overdo it. And I can already tell it's starting to become overdone, because if it's starting to become too bright, then it will stand out as, oh, look, wait, he did something to that eye because it's becoming too bright. And so in that case, and here, let me zoom out. Let me go back out a little bit, or go back in a minute and undo that for a minute. All right, let's undo that. Let's duplicate that layer so that we can always turn it down if we do too much. There we go. So now we duplicate that layer and paint it back in. And that way, if you did too much, because it's on its own layer, you can always turn it down with the opacity. So you can reduce how much you just did. All right. Now, the next thing that I love doing with eyes, and I'll again show you before and after, we'll duplicate the layer again, is using the sharpen tool, which has been around for years, but it got way better a few years ago with the Protect Detail, which is on by default here for the sharpen tool. And with the sharpen tool, I can now go in and just sharpen the eye. So I just make that eye much sharper than it was before. And it looks like I just did a couple brush strokes. It doesn't look like much. When you turn it off, the eyes look dull compared to when you turn it on. It just makes the eyes pop a little bit more than they would have before you did it. So that's off and that's on. Okay, great. Let's bring that back down. Now, the next thing I would do for the lines under the eyes. So, and this is one of those things where if you remove all this, you're going to make her look like she's an infant and unnatural. But we can certainly reduce it. One of the things that Tim mentioned earlier about just not removing everything, but just reducing it. First thing I want to do, though, is this one little part here that kind of stands out for me. That I am going to take the batch tool and I am going to remove that. Okay, that's okay. I don't mind removing that. But this part under the eye, let's go ahead and select that again with the patch tool. All those little lines. And let's say that I now patch it completely out. That's what looks unnatural. But what you can do is before you deselect, you can go into your edit menu and you can fade patch selection. Once you deselect, fade is gone. You can't get it back unless you undo the whole thing. But if you fade patch selection while it's still selected, then that gives you undo on a slider. So now I can pull back and say, just bring the lines back a little. Maybe bring them back 50%. Maybe bring them all the way back. That's what it used to look like. I can now dial it in or dial it down to where it looks like they're reduced drastically, but they're not completely gone. So that way, that's how we would do, that's what we would do for things we don't want to completely get rid of, but we don't want to emphasize in the photo or the portrait as much either. So same thing over here on this side. I'm going to just make that same selection over here, completely get rid of it at first. That's going to look unnatural. And then before I deselect, fade patch selection, which is Command-Shift-F or Control-Shift-F on Windows. And just fade it back in, but half as much. And that way, like I said, you can reduce things like moles or things that need to be there, but don't need to stand out. They don't need to identify your portrait. All right. The next, and again, I could go in and start retouching, like separating the hair from the background, meaning that my background looks like it's just it's the hair starting to blend into it because she's got black hair against the black background. So it would have been great if I could have maybe put a little light behind her So to light that background and kind of separate the hair. Well, with portrait select subject, I can pretty much do that now. So for example, I could go into select subject. That's going to select her. And then I'm just going to go ahead and, because I don't need to cut her completely out from the background, so I don't need to go into select and mask. I'm just going to go ahead and duplicate her onto a layer by herself. So this is what I got from that. And again, it had to try kind of figure out where the hair was compared to the background. Now in this case, I can now go in and I could, just wonder if I want to create a new layer first or just use the background. I'll just use the background layer that was there. Okay, so now I could go in and I could, for example, all right, let's just do it this way. I'm going to grab my ellipse tool. Elliptical marquee. Make a selection behind her head, like so. Oh. Now that I've got that selection, we're behind her because we're in a layer behind her. I'm going to go ahead and feather that selection. So we'll feather it by a lot, like 20 pixels. So soften up that edge. And then we're going to go in and fill it with white. Or even, not even, well, we don't have to use white, but we use whatever color that's lighter. So we use this gray color or we use white, whatever. And fill that area up. Ooh, I didn't feather it nearly enough. Hang on. Let's go undo that again. And let's feather it by a lot more. Modify, feather. That was 20. Let's try 80. I want to feather it quite a bit. There we go. All right, let's try that again. That's better, but still, it could be feathered out even more. Oh, you know what? We don't have to feather it. We'll just leave it the way it is. Okay, so now that we got that in place, the next thing I might want to do is just simply apply a Gaussian blur to that, because the Gaussian blur will kind of just help diffuse it and make it not stand out as much. There we go. I don't want to do too much because it's also the background behind her. And then we'll just lower the opacity of it. So that way we can kind of create that illusion of a light behind her head, separating her head from her hair from the background, using just that technique of putting literally a white spot behind her, and we can even maybe blur it out a little bit more. You know what? Here. I'm just never satisfied. Hang on, let's just do it on its own layer. If I do it on its own layer, then I've got complete control over it. All right, now let's go ahead and fill it. There we go. Now that white's on its own layer, I can do whatever I want. So filter, blur, Gaussian blur. I could play with it all day long. Perfect. There we go. As soon as we let that accept. All right, and then lower the opacity of it. There we go. That's the kind of effect I was looking for. Just something to kind of separate her from that background a little bit more. And again, if I would have put a light on the background, I wouldn't be doing this in post. But just to give you an idea that even if you forgot to do something, or now you're looking at the subject and you're saying, hey, I wish I could have separated her more from that background because black hair on a black background is just hard to see, then you could just go ahead and simply add that back in. All right, next thing we're going to do is, while we've got her separated on top here, we're going to go ahead and do my finishing technique, which is it's kind of a dodge and burn sculpting technique. So basically we're going to take her layer, we're just going to duplicate it. Now that we got her layer duplicated, we're going to go ahead and set the blend mode to luminosity. All right, so you see no visible difference. But now that we got the blend mode to luminosity, we're going to go ahead and dodge and burn. So actually we're going to set the blend mode to, or the opacity to 50% as well. All right, so dodging and burning. So you have a burn tool and you have a dodge tool. The burn tool is used to make areas of the photo that are dark, darker, or areas, and the dodge tool is to make areas of the photo light that are lighter. And it will make something that's light, dark, or dark, light, but that's typically what you're doing it for in a portrait. So for example, around the edges of the face, where you can see the shadows like right here, and you can see the shadow around her face, I might want to emphasize that a little bit more by making that area a little darker. Now, it won't look like I'm doing much at first, but once you see it kind of come together at the end, you'll say, oh, wow, I can really see the difference. All right, so I'm just going to go ahead and make my brush a little bit bigger. Again, grabbing my stylus, I'm just going to come in around this edge and just darken this edge. Now, again, you won't see a big difference, like I said. It won't really look like I'm doing anything. But all of these shadows areas around her collarbone, around her neck, all of these areas that are shadowed, I'm just going to go ahead and shadow a little bit more. All right, then I'm going to grab my dodge tool. Then I'm going to come into the areas that are lighter and make them lighter. So for example, I used to say, like I said, I would whiten the eyes. I don't do that nearly as much as I used to because I use dodge now if I want to brighten the areas of the eyes to kind of brighten them up a little bit. So these contours, these areas that are brighter around her arms, around her shoulders, I'm just going to go ahead and brighten these areas up a bit. And now if I turn that layer off, and I kind of overdid it just to emphasize it, but if I turn that layer off, that's before. So like I said, it's a buildup. You really don't see it until it hits you all at once. And then that's after. So you can kind of see the contouring that that's doing with dodging and burning, kind of sculpting the subject and making the subject look a little bit more defined. Now, if it's too much, like if I turn that on and say, oh my God, that's really starting to be too much, then remember that's on a layer. So you can always lower the opacity of it and bring it down a bit if you think you did too much, or if you didn't do enough, you can bump up the opacity. So again, before, after. All right, so let's check in and see where we are on this particular portrait compared to where we were when we started. This is where we started. Again, not a huge difference, but if we turn everything back on now, you can really start to see the differences you've made. Now, the other thing I might do is, like, for example, this area of the armpit here where I can just kind of see the little folds of skin. I usually reduce those or remove them completely. So let me get rid of my dodge and burn layer or merge it in. And I might grab the patch tool and just kind of remove one of those or multiples of those. Just because, again, no need to emphasize that. We all have it. But it doesn't need to be emphasized in your portrait. All right, see if there's one on the other side. Yep, so again, we all have a fold there, but we don't need to see 2 or 3 of them. I can see some acne or something there. We can get rid of, oh, that was a hair. Definitely don't want that stray hair on the photo. There we go. Now, necklines, we all have them, but again, I'm just not a fan of seeing them in my portrait. So is anyone going to miss that? No, not really. We know her neck bends, but we don't need to see the line where it bends. All right. So now once I'm done, of course, I would want to keep all those layers just in case I need to come back and make any adjustments or not. It's up to you. And sometimes you might want to zoom out to kind of do some of the retouching because this is primarily the view that people are going to see it. Most people aren't going to zoom in on your portrait. They're going to see it zoomed out. So whatever you can see zoomed out, that's what really stands out. All right. So let's go ahead and save it. So it's saving a PSD file. And it's going to take a few seconds because of the layers and the size of this file. And I think it's also saving it to my file server. But it's going to take a few seconds to do that. And then once it's done, I'm going to close it. And it's going to put it back in Lightroom, right next to the original Lightroom Classic. Or Lightroom for that matter. So Farrah's asking, does sharpening the eye basically adding some contrast to it? It's not just adding contrast, it's actually sharpening the pixels. So just like when you use a sharpen filter, hey, Scott Kelby's in the house, what's going on? Just like when you're using a sharpen filter, it's just applying it to a brush. So, okay, so now that we got that in place, let's go ahead and close this out. And if we head back to Lightroom Classic, like I said, it will put it right next to the original. So if we look at the original, here's the original, let's zoom out. That's the original we started with, and that's the retouch. So remember what I said about the coloring? Don't worry about that, because see, it's the same when we come back to Lightroom. It didn't change the actual color. And I made it change the look of it in Photoshop because of the color calibration, but it's the same toning that we had in Lightroom. So that's the Lightroom original. That's the Photoshop retouch that we just did. So you can really start to see those differences. All right, so let's go ahead and pop out of this. And let's go ahead now, head back to Photoshop, where I want to talk about some things really quickly. I only got like 6 minutes left. All right, so let's kind of do some of the things that just are quick and down and dirty tricks for retouching. One of which, when you have a situation like this where, we have his face hidden for identity purposes, but someone says, oh my God, my bulge is sticking out. Can you make me not stick out so much? Now, here's the problem with this, and this is why we call these Photoshop fails. You notice that there's a pole or some kind of structure behind this. And so if this gets bent or twisted or turned in some way, we'll know you did something in Photoshop. So you have to sometimes do these techniques without destroying what's behind it. So in the filter menu, you have something called Liquify. And in Liquify, what you want to do before you start, because here's what will happen. This is what I mean by we'll know you did it. If I go ahead and crease my brush and start pushing that in, then you can see the structure gets pushed in too, and that's what's not going to work. So what you want to do is you want to grab the Freeze Mask brush. I never know which one it is unless I hover over it. There it is. The Freeze Mask tool. And you want to freeze this area of the portrait so that nothing gets disturbed here. So we can go ahead and just freeze all of this space in front of our tummy so that none of this moves when we actually make our retouch. Okay, so now that we did that, we can go back to the warp tool, make our brush nice and big, and then we're just going to push that in just a little bit. Now, he can lose like 10 pounds. He can't lose 100 pounds because then people will know. So we're just going to tighten them up a little bit, and we'll go there. All right. So again, just a quick subtle thing, and maybe that's too much. Maybe bring it out just a little bit because he just wanted to make sure he looked fit enough for his portrait, but not crazy like he lost 100 pounds. So that's before, and that's after. All right. So just a quick Liquify tip that if you freeze the area around it, then you go with your gut. Then you won't, it won't be such a dead giveaway that you did it, because when we can see what you stretched, then we know you did something with Liquify. All right, same thing with Liquify here. One eye is just bigger than the other. And so what you can do is just go into your filter menu. It was a good question, and I was wondering how it would work. Christine, did I miss your question? What was your question? Someone asked about batching the initial adjustments. Did he answer that? I didn't answer batching, but yeah, you can certainly batch the initial adjustments in Lightroom. So for example, all the white balance needs to be the same. I would absolutely batch that. All of the camera correction needs to be the same. I would certainly batch that in Lightroom before I even started on that. So a lot of that probably was already done, especially for the white balance. That's why it didn't need to be adjusted. But yeah, good question, and that is why, that is what I would have done up front. All right, so let's go to liquefy. And face aware, liquefy is the people or the person thing. So as I hover over each section of the photo, it identified his mouth, it identified his nose, it identified each eye. So since it identified the eyes, we can actually go in and I'm just going to go ahead and use my, my sliders here. So we can make that left eye smaller. Now, again, that's the size of his eye. If we make it too small, it might be a dead giveaway that we did something because, he is used to seeing one eye bigger than the other. But that's the one thing that, again, we can just tweak it and make it not be such a gigantic difference between the two. Just bringing it down a bit. All right, click OK. And again, before, after. All right. And if you thought it should go down more, you should bring it down more. All right, I got 3 minutes left. Let's do a quick, let's do this one. All right, broken tooth. So unfortunately, we don't want the guy to have a broken tooth. So what we can do is we can either use part of the existing tooth to cover this up, or we can use the other tooth that's good and replace this one. So whichever one you think is better for your subject. So I'm just going to go ahead and just lasso around this existing tooth. All right, and then we'll just hit Command J to put that on its own layer. And now that we got that on its own layer, we can free transform it. So I can flip it, I can right click on it, and I can flip it horizontal. So, and then by the way, that's a whole nother tooth. And then we can rotate it into place, scale it down if we need to. And then once we're there, once we get it in place, of course, it's still got some of that background, which I grabbed too much of. So we can just add a layer mask to that extra tooth layer and paint with black to get rid of the excess gap area that hang on, what am I doing here? Set my opacity back up to 100%. There we go. Just kind of fill in those gaps, literally. And if you need to move it over, scale it down, whatever else you need to do, you can, because, it's its own tooth on its own layer. So maybe make it a little smaller. I think I like the placement. And yeah, there we go. So just a quick fix of a tooth, where, again, that's now not fixing a gap between a tooth because that's natural. But where there's a tooth where it's broken and it's going to be fixed one day, then why not give that person that now? That's how I handle the eye issue. I love this trick. Okay, I can use the warp tool, blah, blah, blah. Okay, I'm just making sure I didn't miss anybody's question. All right, and we are out of time. The Photoshop Daily Creative Challenge is going to start up in about 5 minutes from now. And I don't have anything else I can do in the time that I have left. So with that said, I don't want to get cut off, so because it will cut me off. So I don't want to do that either. I just want to thank everyone for watching me on the masterclass today. Stick around for the Photoshop Daily Creative Challenge and more masterclasses on different subjects after the Photoshop Daily Creative Challenge. And with that said, cheers everyone. Thanks for watching, and we will catch you on the next one. I'll be back next Friday for more. And as always, if you have a suggestion or a topic you'd love to see, by all means, drop that in the chat on what you would like to see in the Photography Masterclass. Cheers, everybody. Thanks for watching. We'll catch you on the next one. Bye, everybody.